What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, we get a return visit from my friend and sociologist of religion, Gerardo Marti. And this conversation was inspired by a little dream I had of hanging out with him and a whole bunch of dead sociologists. And you're going to hear the dream. But this conversation's a blast because we start to unpack all the different features and elements of culture that are at work changing just what the spiritual and religious landscape looks like and how we're to understand the growing conversation around a meaning crisis. What is the crisis of meaning going on in our culture? How can the skills, wisdom, and tools of a sociologist, especially a cool, fun, nerdy one like Gerardo, bring to unpacking it? I hope you enjoy this conversation half as much as I did. And if you did, you're going to go, whoa, Tripp, this is my new favorite episode. Well, hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and returning to the podcast is Gerardo Marti, who is a sociologist on top of just being a really nice person and a lot of fun to talk to. And he has been a sociologist investigating religion throughout his career, looking at the emergence of evangelicalism of the SoCal variety, the Crystal Cathedral, the emerging church movement, the relationship of white supremacy and religion. Like, he's a sociologist that does religion, talks about all sorts of topics. And I said to him, Gerardo, I had a weird dream. Now, this is true story. Usually I dream about dead people that I'm reading and going like, I can't get them on the podcast. Sometimes I might be the Pope because he's never returned my email. I'm like, come on, Papa Francis. But I emailed Gerardo and told him that I had a weird dream that we were on the coast of North Carolina with a whole bunch of dead famous sociologists. We're talking like Weber, Marx, Durkheim, Bordeaux, Habermas, Baudrillard, and we're having ourselves a good time. And we were discussing modernity's engine for the meaning crisis and how they all diagnose modernity, the problems of meaning, purpose, value in it, the deterioration of community, religion's role, and then what are we doing with the more secular our culture gets? We get the rise of these authoritarian right regimes, and I don't remember what the solution was, but we had something amazing. So I emailed Gerardo, who's the only living sociologist that happened to be hanging out with everyone, and told him about this, and he didn't say, Tripp, don't email me about your dreams about me. He said that sounds like a lot of fun. And so I'm super pumped to have you back on. It was great to see you not that long ago at Princeton for the Hartmut Rosa event, which I assume this is how my, whatever. We don't have to get into Freud and Jung, but somehow in my mind this dream was instigated. But you're the only person I've emailed and said, I had a dream about you last night. Do you want to talk on the internet?
Wow, this is a point of honor. Thank you. Thank you, Tripp.
This was actually kind of a funny part of the email exchange where I was like, oh, about the meaning crisis. And then you're like, so exactly what is that? And then I'd never tried to explain it. I just have heard lots of people on podcasts talk about it and then see it in like, oh, an Atlantic article or the New Republic or, people that are academics that write for normal audience reference it. And so I tried to come up with a definition. And then you, like an academic, reads it, and then it was like, there are 15 scholars reference points here I could think of and blah, blah, blah. Like, so I'm interested after my prompting, what was going through a sociologist's head when I said, I really want to talk to you about this because all the dead ones aren't around that were hanging out with us, probably on the Outer Banks, having some fun. Since we can't do that till the eschaton, Gerardo.
Well, I love talking about meaning. We have been consumed with meaning for a very long time as thinkers. I mean, this is where you can go all the way back to the Greeks, and you only know the Greeks because somebody wrote about them. I'm sure that people were thinking about meaning even before then. So part of the challenge is we've all been thinking about meaning. That's from the beginning of philosophy. It's certainly embedded in theology. And as a sociologist, there's a lot of evidence that says that the beginnings of sociology have to do with what you're calling the crisis of meaning, the attempt to make sense of these new societal arrangements that involve economics, government, intimacy, family relationships, work and labor, the transportation and shrinking of the world through transportation and communication. So there are a lot of things that can initiate some sense of why would we say that we have a crisis of meaning. I think in many ways, the meaning crisis has been there for a very long time. If anything, it's just been accelerated in different ways so that we are having not just like one giant crisis of meaning at certain critical periods of life. Now it seems like it's happening on a monthly, weekly, maybe even on a daily basis. So I think that with a hat off to Hartmut Rosa, who was a very generous person when we met him and interacted with him, I think there's a sense in which the speed at which we're having to question a lot of things and questioning ourselves has accelerated these questions to such a degree that we're calling it more of a crisis, but I think it's a familiar thing. And I think once we get into it, I think people go, oh yeah, yeah, oh. And we can draw on so many different people because it's so abstract, just when you talk about the crisis of meaning, that I
Mm-hmm.
think that I think we can enter into it at many different points. So I have things that I prefer in terms of how I approach the crisis of meaning. This isn't meant to normalize it, but at least to go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And to give us handles for how we might come to understand why it exists, where it comes from, and also, is it just a condition of life that we're kind of stuck with for a long time?
One of the things that shows up across all the different kind of figures that are trying to talk about the present, they're always intimately connected to their description of modernity and then kind of how modernity runs aground of sort. And sometimes it might start with Duns Scotus. Other times it might start with Martin Luther and the Reformation. Others it might start with, the emergence of like the breakdown of the feudal system and the emergence of early capitalism. Others it might, we're going to go to Kant or Descartes, right? Like there are these different ways we render modernity that then describe the kind of like normal engine that if we look back in history and go, okay, well, it got to an equilibrium, it's running around for a while, and then it starts doing some weird stuff, and we
Mm,
thought we had got back to a new one after World War II, and then
mm.
boom shakalaka. You know, the problems that are showing up in Europe and the West are also showing up in India and China in these different ways, and there's something going on.
Mhm.
So, as a sociologist, when you're looking at how we tell history to describe the present, are there kind of like different narratives that you find more viable? Are there different features of that story you think are more important? Are there ones that, as someone who's looked at different religious movements, that
Mm,
you go, if we had paid attention to this, we might actually give a better account of what's
mm,
going on?
mm. Well, I think part of the real difficulty is that I believe that all of us really get a poor education in history. Every time we pick up something that really goes into some really great depth and
Mm-hmm.
literally on any period of history, it highlights how much more contentious and how much more of a shock waves and disruptions were occurring. And so if we look at like the birth of Christianity and we look at when Jesus came, and it's like, my gosh, this was a tremendously disruptive period of time. I don't think anybody would call it a point of equilibrium, only from the standpoint of the dominance of the Roman Empire. But there are a lot of people who lived during that time who did not experience it as a form of equilibrium, right? And if you go into further, you want to pick any period of time. Was the Byzantium period a period of equilibrium? I don't think so. And the period of the Crusades didn't help this. But I think that what happened, and this is talking with a medievalist friend of mine, he made a point of saying that once the Crusades utterly failed, then the Western Church stopped looking to the East and they were stuck for a moment about what to do, which is wars between empire that happened among the nations at the time. And once this new territory to the west was discovered, once this entirely different framework where you could find land, materials, and people to enslave, that was the decisive shift westward. And that was not a moment of equilibrium either, right? So we have moments
Mm-hmm.
in which then that initiates a period of history which we are still living under in many ways. So for me, being able to discern the dividing of the world from the east to the west once the fall of Constantinople happened. And we started to only be able to say, okay, this is what we have to work with. And the competition that happened out of that, now we have new frameworks that include the transatlantic slave trade. We also have the beginnings of credit and banking in new forms. We have the acceleration of war and what war means, a radical racial hierarchy, and a radical expansion of wealth in these unexpected directions. So by the time you get to the United States, which, in school, sometimes we just start at 1776, we've really entered at the middle of the book for what was happening in the Western world. And I don't think that there's anything about the colonial period we would say is a point of equilibrium. We know that because of the compromises and contentions over slavery, that was not a period of peace. That issued forth in the Civil War. The Reconstruction period had radical westward expansion. So basically, you can see that I could probably go into any particular moment and show the manner in which, if a person had lived more than 20 or 30 years, they would have had different crises of meaning for what their circumstances look like and trying to understand the world. So I think we are trying to get to a point where I was thinking about this the other day. One of the goals that we have as people who live today is leisure. Okay. That's what we want. We want a time when we can sit by the pool or watch a movie and just stream and not have any other care and concern, right? And I think that the dominance of the desire for leisure and the wealth and stability that's required to have leisure is something that is constantly disrupted. And so I wonder, in some sense, how much the pursuit of leisure is actually at the root of our desire to feel like we're all stable and good and life is the way it should be, right? It's the moment when you take a deep breath and go, ah, because we're not getting that. And the more we don't get that, the more I think that there's a crisis of who we are, what's the world all about, where have we been and where are we going?
What's fascinating about that notion of leisure is it's something that is escaping an increasing number of people, even in kind of the more economically privileged countries, right? And I think that's something that came up in our conversation with Rosa, is the number of people who recognize that to even have the same status socially, economically, culturally, to hand that to their kids, it actually requires success in competition and achievement, right? Where there's like the need, he talks about the frenetic standstill, like you have to always be accelerating and growing and these kinds of things, not to like make progress, not because you're greedy, because you're genuinely fearful of becoming a non-person to a system. Andrea Reckvig, I don't know how you say his name, is another German sociologist, talked about how the middle class of the post-war economy is being split, where we're now going to end up with a hourglass shape, where part of the middle class is going to move to a precarious working class, and the other part will be kind of like the high culture class, and that's sorting all sorts of people on lines of success that don't correspond to the meritocracy myth or like the inherited money lines, right? And so there's this new sorting, which kind of like then brings that existential register that you pointed out. Like, yeah, there's always been a meaning crisis for a whole lot of people. They just didn't get to write the history or talk about it, right? Like that now, like the people with humanities degrees are feeling as precarious, like where there's maybe a debt slavery for your degree or whatever, kind of like attachment to a system that you have to succeed and work at. And so it expands the number of people that are like, hey, where's the givens? Where's the assumptions? What's going on? And I wonder, like, if that moment, when the meaning crisis happens, that moment, and there's no symbolic reservoir, there's no like shared narrative or structure, then that's the other feature, right? So there's more people that are materially experiencing that kind of precarious sense, and there's more options for a social structure, and more of the big narratives have been occupied or accommodated to the economic narrative that is like, go faster, be more efficient, speed, scale,
Mm-hmm,
efficiency,
mm-hmm.
all three A's for Rosa.
Yeah, totally agree. I think here now, to resource our thinking, let's make a difference between the mental structures that we live with and the material conditions that are around us. Okay, so mental structures, material conditions. Both are inescapable, but the material conditions do shape a lot of what is given to us in our mental structures. So when we look back at living in communities, okay? We've never been completely homogeneous in terms of our communities, but there is an argument to be made that in an earlier period of our history, and I'm not talking about centuries ago, I'm saying, let's go back to the late 19th, maybe early 20th century. You could imagine yourself living in a stable community. That stable community gave us mental structures. You don't figure things out. You're told the recipes for knowledge of how to understand the world, how to understand yourself, how to understand where your role is, how things work, all kinds of things. Okay. So that's your mental structures, and the material conditions support that because you're kind of more in one place and there's a lot of familiarity around you. People do not experience crises in meaning when you're surrounded with familiarity. Okay. When the novelty does not disrupt what is familiar. So once you have the acceleration of migration and movement, you have an acceleration of immigration in the United States, a particular spike that started to happen in the 1880s. You have urbanization, the forced move from rural communities into more dense, more active urban communities. And you also have new communication that's giving you different kinds of aspects of the world, things you've never thought about, things you've never considered. You have the beginnings of religious plurality happening, even though there was a lot of effort to keep that at bay. And then you have a series of what sometimes is called scientific breakthroughs, but in other ways, they're just like, hey, guess what? Things don't work the way you think they do, right? And to the extent that it benefits us and works in our direction, great. But in other ways, it might challenge really fundamental notions of how we think things operate, like do racial differences exist, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. Okay. So what starts to happen, I think, is that if we say that we create epistemic cultures that we can ensconce ourselves in and feel a sense of coziness for how we understand the world, a lot of things that were happening in the material conditions of the world were constantly impeding on that. And it was introducing us to things that we had not considered before: people, places, things, processes, dynamics. And all of a sudden, we have to now shift into saying that however we see the world, we can no longer trust. And
Mm-hmm.
going to church once a week or reading the Bible every day is not going to be enough to sustain a cozy epistemic culture, because we're going to be encountering too many things and it's going to be too fast. And the limitations of what has been built into our religious or theological or devotional systems has not given us enough to be able to deal with the constant novelty that's coming at us. Of course, this is a time when new theologies are taking place, new conversational partners, and that is also uncomfortable because now we cannot rely on what is orthodoxy. We're constantly struggling with what is orthodoxy, and there are concrete institutional fights that are happening, competition for dollars, competition for influence and power, that is going to be fighting over what's acceptable orthodoxy or not. That lays the groundwork for a lot of things that I think are more familiar to people in the 20th century.
So you named a number of features there, how the material conditions generate new kind of like where the mental structures have a new context,
That's right.
like immigration, which obviously is diversifying all sorts of things when it goes to culture, industrialization, where you end up moving
Mhm.
in to different places. It also changes what a vocation looks like,
Yeah.
right? From like, say you make an entire shoe and you pass on, being a cobbler to I do one little part
That's right.
of this thing.
Mhm.
The how technology changed things. Both you mentioned like communication, and earlier, obviously the medium message kind of bit and all that kind of stuff on communication, but also a technology like a car or a phone or
Right.
these kinds of things are collapsing distance
Hmm.
that made kind of those more parsimonious
Hmm.
cultures uh,
Boundaries, right?
yeah, created boundaries, and then those scientific ruptures that kind of problematize kind of structures of meaning when, well, these work really well if you have cancer.
Hmm.
It would be really hard not to believe in evolution since
Hmm.
you want to have chemo, and these
Hmm.
kind of things. When you think of meaning, right, in some sense there's this connection between, an individual's thrown into the world. You're going to have your biological inheritance, and that's something that is really shared across our species, despite what people might invent culturally about race. But there are also those cultural givens. And as a sociologist, like, what are the features that come to mind when, say, the plausibility structure of that world you first inherit, like the
Hmm.
world interpreted through the culture you're born into, the family, race, gender, class, all that kind of stuff. What happens to those plausibility structures that didn't happen before when these material conditions change? Like, what are the elements that come to mind as a sociologist of religion that make those kind of that inherited social cultural fabric become fragile?
Hmm. So I appreciate the way you're putting it together because this very much resonates with the kinds of things that we think about in trying to figure out where the modern self is and what modern communities look like. So I would start with whatever we understand reality to be, we'll never be able to get at that. Reality in whatever it is, capital R reality, is utterly unfathomable, right? And we all, I think, have mostly bought into this. Kant was not the first, but he was the major person that kicked the door down
Mm-hmm.
hermeneutically. And then from there, then you have others that built and sort of said, okay, however we approach things, it has to be approached through the apparatus that we have available to us biologically, right? So we have an apparatus that allows us to try to make sense of things. And what the sociologists say is it's still not about perception. It's about the packages of meaning that are given to us out of the communities that we're a part of. So the communities give us packages that work relatively well and most of the time,
Mm-hmm.
especially if for the most part things don't change, right? If for the most part things don't change too much or they only change slow enough, then you can patch this together and accommodate as it goes. When the pace of change happens more quickly and when other things start to intrude that are new and novel, you can no longer trust generational transmission. You now have a bias more towards youth, for example, or younger people, or those who are active in the economy or in the world, in the metropolitan world in some way, because they are the ones who are actually encountering it most directly, and they're the ones who are trying to figure out, given whatever they have available to them, to cobble together new meanings. They enter then into different cultures, whether it's literary or just a newspaper, or even television. These are ways in which this is constantly being renegotiated. This is what it means to kind of keep up with things, generally, right? Symbolized by having a newspaper in front of you that you read every day. You now enter into a time where you have to keep up with whatever the world is happening in the world, because otherwise you're going to be hopelessly lost. And not only will you be existentially lost, you actually won't be able to work. Like you won't be able to be in relationships. You won't be able to do things. So that I think is part of what we have to accept, is that the biological apparatus of what we have is incomplete when it comes to meaning. Meaning has to be supplied from somewhere, and it is culturally or socially established. Socially established things cannot be autocratically assigned. And so there has to be some time for people to figure out how are we going to put this together, which creates the cobbling of meaning from different communities over time. One more thing, the more that we are a part of the urban world, the more we are part of more than one group. So we are no longer
Mm-hmm.
ensconced in one group. We're a part of two, three, five, maybe even dozens of groups simultaneously. And each one has its own knowledge structure that it's trying to forward. Your church is going to try to forward a set of meanings that they believe matters for everywhere and everything. Your school, your educational system, the vocational aspect of things that you do, everything's going to try to do that. And when you exit any of those particular meaning structures, it's kind of like standing in the alley between two buildings. So human beings individually find themselves increasingly trying to bridge or at least cross between different meaning structures in order to be able to live out their everyday lives. I think that's a distinctive contribution that I get from Ulrich Beck, who really emphasized that the fact that we have to have a biography is because there is no socially defined sense of self that's given anymore. We have to craft, cultivate some assemblage of who we are based on the multiple structural connections that we have in our lives. And so that's what's a unique aspect of, I think, a mental, and at that point, it's not the mental structure, it's a mental effort to accommodate all of these different things and to know when to quote unquote code switch in our
Mm-hmm.
behavior and in the self that we promote for ourselves, depending on the situation that we find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. So, about that last point, in a sense, you're like Beck's emphasis here is, in some sense, human beings until relatively recently weren't tasked as an individual with self-narration, right?
Correct.
Like, you were born into a world where, if we just take for the West Christendom, right? Like you were baptized and everyone else you ever know was baptized. And at that baptism, your origin story was connected to the shared origin story of the West. Jesus had a baptism, you had a baptism, and everyone else did, and it's connected to another origin story about Adam. And then, you have all these life transitions, and they all get recapitulated in the same cathedral. Funerals are there, and even your own finitude structured in relationship to eschatological hope. There's this whole narrative
Right.
story. When you learn your neighborhood, your neighbors' names and faces, you're also learning Adam, Eve, Jesus, Abraham, Sarah, and company. And so this sense that the moment there's a multiplicity or a multitude of narratives and communities that individuals participate in, the responsibility of sorts of self narration gets put on the individual.
Mhm.
It's no longer kind of the grace or gift of a tradition, it's the responsibility of the individual. And that's a modern predicament.
Absolutely. Now, I think that we don't want to hyper idealize that somehow communities were isolated so much in the past that we did not have these kinds of issues.
Right.
Okay. Because certainly we learn most of people who hear us know something about the Reformation. And we know that the Reformation did not exist in these epistemic enclaves, right? We were constantly having to negotiate these issues, and it's a good way of approaching, or at least beginning to understand how this works. But I do think that the pressure of the individual, the assertion of property rights of the individual, the assertion that the individual will matters, and that's how you actually accomplish things. More and more, the individual cannot simply adopt an entire knowledge framework from any particular structure, even though each one wants to dominate you. Each one. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you work for a corporation, they want you to adopt the mission. They want you to adopt your role responsibility. They want you to take on their idealized values. And that's a condition of being tired even, right? Let alone just remaining on task, because you constantly have to make sure that you're like belong to this thing. But step
Or
out
you
of
at least smile
at
and wear
least
your
you
flair.
well, you got your little badge or you got the little
Yeah.
mission statement you can state, or you got the folder with the logo, whatever it may be, right?
I was an Apple buddy. I won the Golden Apple
Well,
Award,
there you go. There you
at
go.
Applebee's.
There you And so from there then, once we once we if I'm trying to imagine this. Once we step out of that and we enter into other places that also want our entire meanings, then that starts to take place. Once you join the university, once you join a church, synagogue, mosque, or other kinds of things. So there are precious few areas that don't now require so much of ourselves, because what they're defining is a set of moral standards
Mm-hmm.
for what is right and wrong, what's the ethical imperative that we're supposed to take on, and what is the expectation of behavior among us once we step into this sphere. And we don't notice it as much when we go to like buy shoes or groceries or something like that. those have a less existentially defined meaning structure, but it is still defined by a high level of morality for what is expected of you as a person in this place. What are the kinds of things that we talk about? What's acceptable? What is it that's the range of things that you are to be in this particular space? And as spaces like that expect greater privatization, I think in some ways it's because we are so overwhelmed already having to cross boundary after boundary from structure to structure that a place like the grocery store or going to a bookstore or going to the public park becomes a place of relative rest where we are not asked to actively negotiate the big questions and can just kind of take care of some basic fundamental needs at the moment.
Well, you mentioned the first part of that last answer about this shift from generational transmission, and I imagine that just because being a pastor's kid that was started in rural North Carolina and then moved to Raleigh and then L.A. and Scotland, like I feel like just the place I was in has shifted so much.
Mm,
When you said that, I felt, oh, that's my story. Because I
mm,
remember when I met my first person of another religion, and she was Methodist.
mm,
Because everyone else I knew was a variety of Baptist.
mm,
And we had judgments about the other tribes of
mhm,
Baptists.
mhm.
And all the way to, you know, a street with six world religions on it in Los
Right,
Angeles.
right.
And yet, like the structure of religion in America has well, structure of religion in general, but in America, especially until World War II, the generational transmission's been an important part of it. It wasn't until after World War II that most of even the mainline denominations end up consolidating in ways they aren't simultaneously ethnic churches, right? There were German Lutherans, and then there were Swedish Lutherans, and they were still parsed that way.
Mhm, mhm.
And so when you think of, essentially in like my grandparents' time to now, you have even a reshifting of denominations, and now who really picks a church because it's part of a denomination? When you think of like those communitarian structures, religious or not,
Mhm,
that became the vessels of generational transmission,
mhm,
what have been the features as someone who's looked at different parts of these movements
mhm.
as to how the deterioration of generational transmission has impacted religion in American context?
Well, I have thought about this too, and it relates to our politics today. So let's start with the immigration surge that happened in the 1880s and 1890s. That created a panic, a nativist panic that was more ethnically and racially based. In fact, the study of eugenics did not emerge because we were trying to prove somehow that Black people were inferior. That was just a commonly assumed thing among the greatest portion of the population, the American population, and Western Europe. What was the problem was we had all these people that were maybe white, we're not sure, but are they the right kind of white people? And so decades of efforts then were invested in trying to distinguish between someone from Denmark versus Germany versus France
Mm-hmm.
and versus England. Eugenics was a very careful and interesting effort to parse the differences between white populations. And you can see this in federal government efforts and something called Dictionary of Peoples. And there are ways in which these very fine things, the measuring of noses and skulls and all that kind of stuff, it was really about trying to say, what kind of white people do we want? The result of that in the United States was restrictive immigration. The quotas that came in 1924 and then kept going 1927, these were attempts to block out the wrong kind of ethnic based peoples and to only promote the right kind. Okay. And so immigration dropped precipitously because they weren't allowed to come. We had already had the Asian exclusion, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act, and that led
Mm-hmm.
to the entire Pan Asian research region being blocked off in terms of the capacity to be in America. And even the Chinese weren't allowed to be citizens until the Warren Act in 1950s. So
Mm-hmm.
what you have there is you have first of all, a lessening out of a direct threat to what it was to be a proper American and what was accepted in terms of language, religious orientation, and a general sense of how you live. Because a lot was made of things like hygiene, how many people per family, that kind of thing. Now, once you move past that, you now have white ethnic groups like the Swedes, right? You have Swedish Lutherans, German Lutherans, you have other religious orientations, and they start to establish churches and religious communities that were not just Christian, but they were also ethnically based, with many churches having that native language, at least in those first few decades. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you get to the 1950s, with restrictive immigration, with the Southern and Eastern Europeans no longer being allowed as citizens in the United States, you have an amalgamation between different groups and crossing different ethnic backgrounds so that you have a larger sense of an undistinguished white American. Okay. This is where whiteness in America became the amalgamated white American, that patriotic person who held the flag and was held up as the ideal middle class standard. And that takes us all the way through into the 1950s and 60s. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
what I'm asserting here is there was a sort of general truce called amongst these different Protestant Christians. Some Catholics were allowed, some Jews were allowed, but there was a racialized basis that these were all patriotic people who belonged in our democratic system. Okay. And that broke in the 1960s. For various pressures, immigration changed to even out the numbers between the hemisphere. There were also issues related to the southern border, and that introduced Asians and Latinos into our setting. All of a sudden, these people came who were already Christians, but were considered foreign. At that point, it was not their Christianity or their religion that was the problem. It was that they were not white. And that then dovetailed into a second thing, and that is that all of those white Christian churches that had been growing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s started to consider larger issues about the role of women, women in ministry, and women in society. They started to think a little bit about sexuality, and they started to think a little bit more about the freedom of conscience, people being able to make their own decisions apart from their churches, and of course, from something official from the government. Mainline churches that are called today mainline was just the American church. Conservatives who rebelled against the progressive moves on the part of the American church is what created the new conservatism of what we usually call evangelicalism today. Evangelicalism in America was birthed out of people who left the American church because it was becoming too progressive. And what they created were new religious enclaves. They established epistemic cultures. They founded their own organizations. They fostered their own colleges and other parachurch ministries and publishing houses and bookstores and even an entire music ministry, that these music industries also fed a particular kind of epistemic culture that was going to define itself on some notion that they were being truer to the traditions, truer to what was the actual Christianity of whatever sort that is. And that idealization of what that was became a hard type of orthodoxy that actually became powerful. And it wasn't just powerful privately in terms of religion, it became powerful publicly in terms of our politics. So by the time you get to Reagan, many people talk about the moral majority, but
Mm-hmm.
it is not until the middle of Reagan's presidency, the two terms, that we started to see the rise of what we then called born again Christians. And that dovetailing started to happen that was creating a sense of this is who we are, this is who we're supposed to be. It always rested uneasily with a lot of other people, and it even rested uneasily within, especially from younger people who were still exposed to the increased novelty, boundary crossing of structures, new knowledge and information, and other kinds of things that said to them, I'm not sure I can 100% commit to whatever this is. And so our friends, the people that we know, were a part of movements that started up then in the 80s and 90s to reinstitutionalize or create different pockets to say, we're not going to 100% align with this. We're going to take what we like, but we're also going to try to merge in other things that acknowledge that the world isn't quite as neat and
Mm-hmm.
tidy as we think it is. And that was a radical experiment in American religion and the UK, which is the attempt to say, can we have a religious structure of understanding and a self-defined sense of devotional approach to the world, some sense of piety that still allows for an openness to an ever-changing world that tries to bring down the boundaries and opens up our capacity for being able to deal with change, uncertainty, and complete paradigm shifts. I think that's part of
Mm-hmm.
what takes us where we are today. Because if you want to try to define these things then in relation to what we have seen in 2016 and now 2025, we see that what is the MAGA kind of Christian orientation is one more attempt to isolate an idealized sense of what they think the right way of the world should be, right? That it has a
Mm-hmm.
particular set of standards for how we're to define knowledge, selfhood, family relationships, all the way up to relationships to the federal government, which really is about as close as you can get to defining our relation to existential reality. And so now you
Mm-hmm.
have a series of executive orders in the most surprising way possible, actually supporting a particular epistemic culture and trying to nationalize an epistemic culture that everyone will be obligated to follow, because if not, then federal funds are going to be frozen. You can't get a job. You
Mm-hmm.
can't live in your house. You can't get your medical care, all those kinds of things. So it is as it has always been, the attempt to assert any form of meaning always comes with force. It's always an aspect of power. What you have, though, is the levers of governmental power being used in ways that we have not seen for a very long time. And that
Mm-hmm.
that I think is what makes it very distinctive.
Yeah. Okay, so there's like a million things that pop in my head. One is I just finished writing this article, so that basically is this the whole new spirituality of manifesting.
Mm. Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
you combine that with nostalgia for the patriarchal past, and
Mhm.
that explains how MAGA wants to be the new civil religion.
Mm.
I just finished the first draft of it, and everything you're saying there's fascinating. But you hinted at this transition from Reagan and a number of movements that have tried all sorts of things and ultimately failed, right, to
Mm.
steer the ship of America, the main expression of white religion in America,
Mm.
be it, say, Schuler, who you have a new
Mhm.
book on, the emerging church movement, engaging in the arts and stuff like you mentioned, like, well, Christians also had this music thing, but it had this other purpose and stuff, and it leads to this. So I kind of want to hear you talk about different movements and what do we actually learn about the current kind of meaning and spiritual crisis by all these failed attempts that in the kind of like drive for control and traditionalist religion, a all encompassing narrative that gives us that kind of mental shared structure,
Mhm.
like it had no interest in being open enough, and it kept reinventing itself in uglier ways where more and more of its kids and grandkids just leave,
Mhm.
but it kept dialing down. So I kind of want you to talk about multiple movements and go, hey, as someone that studied this, kind of the like if you used a weird filter that inverted all the colors on a picture of the meaning crisis, here's what you learn.
Well, I don't know if I know. You'd have to continue to nudge me and redirect, because we're playing fast and loose with a lot of ideas here, a lot of history. But I do want to maybe one way to approach this, if I can shift it a little bit, is,
Yeah.
it's pretty fast. The Seven Mountain Mandate is pretty fascinating, right? Because there is a presumption on the part of many people who don't even know that they believe this, that the world can be neatly summarized as seven different regions of life activity and kind of like general structures of society, and that Christianity should be at the center, if not actually dominating each of these seven arenas of society. Okay. And what strikes me is the notion of a mountain, because a mountain is so stable, right? The mountain doesn't move, and you can climb to the top of it. And the assumption is that there are people who should be placed at the top so that these things can be set and established, right? And that establishment of it is a conquering mentality, right? You can conquer it so that there is no other room for anybody else at the top of the mountain. It's a limited space, right? Which makes it a
Yeah.
competitive space.
And even that notion of mountain, right, is something that one can own. Like,
Exactly.
and you've made like the relationships of humans in these different spheres something that is not human, not social, not relational, but possessible and ownable.
Exactly. And so it's only competition because only so many people can occupy and control the mountain, you know? And I think that that speaks to so much of the notion, first of all, that the world is somehow, however it was established, that somehow there is a world that is stable. It's just
Mm-hmm.
not in the right hands, right? The world itself is not changing. It's just that there are certain people who have wrong ideas about how to govern it, right? And so it creates a notion of stability about the world that is not true to the way the world actually operates. It also creates a false distinction between these different arenas as if they do not overlap, or as if there are only seven or something like that, which, seven's a godly number. Or things like that, which kind of gives you a false sense of the isolation of different spheres of life so that you can have a very clear sense of Christian ethics depending on which sphere you are in. Because this
Mm-hmm.
ends up moving to, a practical ethics of who am I as a Christian in my home? Who am I as a Christian in my office? Who am I as a Christian in my, right? And those kinds of things. And the third thing is that it still yearns for a sense that I already have something figured out. I just need to implement it. It does not create its own problematization about whether the questions or issues are framed in the right way at all and
Yeah.
whether these things are moving. So, it's a very seductive metaphor which feeds what we're calling the meaning crisis because it
Mm-hmm.
will continually provoke a sense of I have to have figured this out. And once you occupy those roles, which we know people who've taken these roles, we see that it can be disastrous when a person takes like a wooden block, just saying, this is how it fits. This is the way it has to fit, and just make it work that way, even if it actually doesn't. And it ignores all of the other complications and shifts and changes that occur. We need a much more fluid, if we're going to adopt a metaphor, and of course there's a warning from taking any one, we need something that's much more fluid, much more changeable, and much more responsive to human community over time, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that even the way, if you think of the spheres like, oh, how am I going to be the good Christian X in this sphere?
Mm.
You're coming in kind of closed, like you already possess what the
Exactly.
you're coming in closed because you know what the correct expression of this is. So then any tension or friction or difference,
Hmm.
in a sense, otherness actually becomes a threat.
That's right.
Um, as opposed to an asset or a potential for creative transformation, or just like something that has potential dignity in it, right? And that spatial metaphor, you started going through that, and in my head,
Mm.
here's what popped in my head:
Mm.
mandates, mountains, and I'm just like, well, what about the prayer of Jabez?
Hmm. Same.
Increase my territory, right? Like, just thinking that like probably like in the top 10 worst exegeted moments of church history, where
Mm.
one little verse taken out of context somehow legitimates saintly celebration for people that are effective at internalizing the demands of neoliberal capitalism
Mm.
into all spheres of their life. But like that same kind of mode right there is happening at this
Hmm.
communal level
Hmm.
when your understanding of a social space is a stagnant thing that's either possessed and determined by you or your enemy,
Right.
and God's on your side. And I just
Right.
find that I mean, it's not like there aren't people in the Bible that do that. It's just they aren't the heroes.
Right.
You
So
know?
right. So the proximity of difference is part of what we're dealing with here. Is that we want people who are struggling with, wait, isn't this what it's supposed to be about? Whatever that might be. It's always going to be threatened by the proximity of differences. And there are more differences, not just the other, it's others, right? There are too many
Oh,
other things that people are struggling with. And so then we go, okay, how do we close the options? How do we close the options? And one way of closing the option is
executive order.
executive order. Absolutely. Well, that's exactly right, by the way. But I was going to go.
Executive orders, you change the map names. Like, there's all sorts of ways you could do this.
And
Gerardo.
done, right? Flip of a. But I was going to go in the direction of saying you only pay attention to what's in the pages of your Bible. So
Yeah.
then it becomes a very hard exegetical effort to make sense of something that's very dense and not entirely all commensurate with each other. But they say, okay, but I'm just going to pay attention to what the Bible says. Because you have to be selective, then that's what the whole proof text thing starts to happen, right? You start collating a bricolage, right, of different verses in order to create what seems like a familiar standpoint that is consistent with the epistemic culture you want to sustain. And these things then can become so hyper focused that you become, well, no, it's not this version, it's this version, right? You can't trust this version or that version. If your whole ontological apparatus is going to rest on precious few words, then all of a sudden which words are chosen become extremely important, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we know that the fight against something like gender inclusive language, which is exegetically correct, all comes because it challenges the epistemic culture that the whole exercise was supposed to support.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's then other ways in which what we typically call fundamentalism, but it's an uncomfortable word, is the closing off of boundaries so that we only pay attention to these set of truths in this particular community defined by these particular people. And at that point, the reason why you have a crisis of meaning within fundamentalism, which is what it's intended to solve, is that because no originality is allowed, no sense of personal integration is supposed to be there other than just soaking in what you've been told, what you've been taught, you actually don't have your own meaning. At that point, the only meaning you have is a constant test that you are mimicking back accurately the things that you have been told. And so it's a constant whiz to be able to answer the question correctly rather than some sense of integrating who am I and who am I supposed to be? It's you're already
Mm-hmm.
told what you're supposed to be. And so you're then supposed to be like this Lego that is putting your block, your particular pegs are supposed to fit all these different idealized holes that live in the world. And the world just doesn't work that way. So within the fundamentalist structure, you are a Lego and you fit. But when you take that same brick and try to apply it to these other structures, all of a sudden it no longer fits. It's not the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. One of the questions that's actually come up for me about this, and you mentioned it earlier, is in one sense there's this tension between material conditions and the mental structures that create this kind of that's kind of like one of the dialectics that going on. Did you mention another one that there's this kind of the inheritance, social inheritance or generational transmissions one, but then there's this other element that is so important for evangelicalism, but also for people that reject it, right? And it's that notion of kind of authenticity or genuine faith, or there are religious versions of it, but some sense of how in a modern context, faith became something you had to do for yourself. But that kind of Protestant, that element of the Protestant principle has remained even if you don't believe in God or are religious.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in how that kind of Lutheran seed, here I stand, I can do no other. I got reason that God gave me so I can trust it in the Bible, and I trust that because I'm concerned about this institution, right? Well, What happens with that engine when the Bible gets contested, just like as part of the tradition, just as much as the Catholic Church, and then reason becomes so effective, it's not so sure about the God stuff, right? Like, do you see that there's something to learn about that kind of the modernity's demand for the individual, authenticity, faith, whatever's going on in that sense, as opposed to actualizing something cultural or social or collective that's important to notice in kind of both sides of this current moment, the way it shows up in militant religious context and in militantly post-religious.
Yeah. Well, you've got me thinking about a lot of ironies, because in many ways, the problem that's created was intended to be a solution to something else.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that that strikes me in how you're talking about this idea of individualizing your faith, and Luther is always a pretty good place to start. You know, I am bound by the word of God and my conviction, right? I am bound by the word of God and my conviction. Well, with that, he began a revolution, but he created all kinds of trouble, right? Because now it has to do with my conviction, right? How I understand. My conviction actually rests over the word of God, sociologically speaking, because it's the conviction that has to rule and decide and make a judgment, right, about what the word of God is saying and how I'm supposed to apply it. Now, churches, let's go back to churches. Christianity exerted through Christian institutions, most often these are congregations, denominational structures that are made up of congregations. They cannot rule every aspect of a person's life. So they are trying to inculcate in a person a set of convictions that they would live out outside of the church. Who are you supposed to be outside of the church, right? That means that I am being entrusted as an individual to apply, to discern, to make decisions and exercise my own power to be able to say, okay, this is what it means for me to be a Christian when I'm no longer in this place, right? It might be the easiest to be a Christian at church because there it's so clear and everybody's supportive, but outside of church, it's a little bit tricky, right? The fact that I now have to be entrusted as an individual means that I, as an individual, exert a lot of power over how I understand Christianity to be applied in a day-to-day way. And that is a personal burden that I have to take on. That's what I'm supposed to take on as a Christian. And that burden, though, does not come with a solution. And so when Charles Shedd wrote, "What Would Jesus Do?" When you read this for yourself, it's a wonderfully romanticized, and it's very sentimental, and you can come away with a great deal of conviction for, oh my gosh, this is what I need to do. The problem is that the world is incredibly complicated, so that when I ask, what would Jesus do? My answer is not going to be the same as the person right next to me, right? The person right next to me may come to very different judgments about what Jesus would do. And that's what we see manifested today politically. People who are absolutely convinced that if Jesus were alive today, he would vote this way and do certain things in this way. And there are others who are like diametrically opposed and say, absolutely not. It's this way. But what got us here is the fact that I'm bound by my conviction. And the conviction then individualizes how I try to work through this. And then I try to find communities that will support the way in which I tend to see the world. And we are large enough and diverse enough in the world that I can actually ensconce myself in communities that resonate with the convictions that I carry, right? And that's what I think then creates powerful blocks of influence where people are constantly reaffirmed that they are right. They are reaffirmed because all these other people are agreeing with me. And this is happening not just physically in terms of being able to be in places, but with the rise of social media, the diversification of channels of influence and education and interaction, and the capacity for us to be able to enter into all of these different places, then we can constantly find, and it's a profitable model, by the way, places that eagerly embrace the convictions that I hold, because I actually did not make them up. They are shared by other communities. And I enter in and I feel both personally affirmed, but also I become more tribalized as a result. So the tribalization and the personalization of conviction is happening simultaneously, which gives it that much more power. We no longer recognize our mental structures as things that are given to us. We think that they're our things, but actually they are things that are constantly reaffirmed, and we embrace them to the extent that they seem to have some level of consistency. And the more people that buy into that, we do that. Now, if the world is not congruent with our epistemic culture, then we may be able to get enough people, enough mobilization where we can exert on the rest of the culture to insist that our epistemic culture is the correct one. And that becomes closer to the Seven Mountain Mandate, right? Because then you place people from our epistemic culture to take positions of power in order to apply that and to find ways to continue to reaffirm for these people that this is actually what truth is and how true human beings should live.
Mm-hmm. One of the elements that gets debated as to exactly how the role and how the narrative should work is how that kind of fourth element of modernity you mentioned earlier, the kind of ruptures in meaning that scientific consciousness brought. Often it gets labeled disenchantment,
Mm,
and that's been problematized in
mm,
all sorts of way. Jason Storm's book on it, which I really enjoyed, kind of looking at just how some of the pioneers of science were not among the most disenchanted people because they were going to seances. But
mhm.
but when you think of that notion of disenchantment, how do you hear that story? Because regardless of how it worked, we have got to the point of kind of the emergence of an exclusive humanism,
Mhm.
right? Like the possibility that, unlike 500 years ago, and the way Charles Taylor talks about it, that when you ask a question, what do you believe in God, people don't laugh at you and go, well, that's the weirdest question. They go, well, I don't know.
Mhm.
And then there's a discussion that the confidence and on whatever answer you give could vary.
Mhm.
So what is the role when you think of kind of the crisis of meaning, where there are these different responses to a potential nihilism, be there of faith or unfaith? Like, what role is that story of disenchantment play in the emergence of exclusive humanism?
Yeah. So this is interesting too, and I can go in different directions here. First, I totally buy into a Weberian disenchantment idea. When Luther walked into the woods, he was convinced there were spirits and sprites and those kinds of things. When you and I walk into the woods, we just see trees. Okay, so
Well, he also thought that when he went to the bathroom. If anyone had a qualifying exam on Luther, you'll know that the man thought there were demons in his colon, and IBS is a different.
Well, even today, I was at a cash register and my card wasn't quite working, and so the person said, "You need to just cast the demons out. You need to say, 'Demons be gone.'" So these kinds of things exist
Did it
everywhere,
work?
and sure enough, it did.
All right, good. I knew you had the skill, Gerardo. Not everybody can do it that quick.
But this idea of disenchantment, I buy in that there is a generalized sense that the world has become more tangible and immediate, and we trust more of this empirical sense of what's going on rather than some abstract sense of things. I buy in. The difficulty with that narrative in terms of this conversation is we cannot equate disenchantment with the loss of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning still exists. Meaning has always been there, but we now have many different ways in which we can approach meaning. And the person that I would tend to blame for this kind of thing, the collapsing of immanence and transcendence, would be Hegel. So when Hegel started to say, look, not only do we only perceive parts of the world, but whatever the world is comes from us, right? When we read Phenomenology of the Spirit, it's a really quite an amazing exercise to think through how he put together his understanding of ontology. And he says, look, if whatever makes sense and whatever vagueness or whatever reality or concreteness we experience, it comes from us, right? Now, what I would add is that there is a social component to trying to understand what is considered to be concrete, what's accepted, and therefore we act as if it's concrete versus those things that we don't accept as concrete or think are illegitimate and can just ignore, that they don't exist or don't matter for our behavior or the way in which we put things together. So, disenchantment, yes. But disenchantment has tended to mean that there was a dominating spiritualized sense of the sacred that we all accepted in common. That only works if we assume that there's only one sense of the sacred and that everybody shared it. We know that there's actually many more approaches to the sacred than what we typically think of. And the fact that it declined was because the sacred became segregated. It
Mm-hmm.
occupied certain spaces and not all spaces. And that's where Eliade comes in, right? To be able to sort of say, this is a moment in which eternity crosses the temporal realm. When we enter this moment or this space. And what has happened with contemplative movement or mindfulness is really, again, back to Hegel in a way to say, hey, guess what? We all have access to the sacred. We have access to the sacred within us. And what we do is we need to work through a process by which we open ourselves up to be able to access the sacredness that is always there. And then to have the capacity to access or engage that sacredness in any particular moment. That's what I get out of the little book on Brother Lawrence, the Brother Lawrence and the
Mm-hmm.
prayer of Brother Lawrence. That to me it fits very well into the contemplative and mindfulness kind of movement that we have today, because Brother Lawrence was living in the sense that we ourselves could bring ourselves into a continuous presence of the eternal through prayer. And that if we did that, then we would not have to worry about the mundane or shocks of everyday life that take us out of that reality, because he was convinced that was ultimate reality, and being rooted in that ultimate reality is what's going to guide us in our day-to-day lives. And I think
Mm-hmm.
maybe the power of the book is there, but I think maybe the lack of people really embracing it is the fact that the world doesn't conform to our notions of being able to somehow sustain a sacred connection in every moment, because so many other structures just don't abide by that kind of ontology.
One of the differences I think in how one reads Brother Lawrence now versus how he would have been heard then is, right, like after the modern subject comes, it takes a modern subject to say something like, "Oh, you have to sustain,"
Yes.
right? And I feel like that's one of those elements that sometimes gets talked about in, under disenchantment, which it is often a statement about explanatory discourse, like the collapsing of explanatory discourse towards efficient causation,
Mm.
and then these other levels of causation get relativized, and that's different than like the way you rendered Brother Lawrence there. In a sense, it's kind of like a Heideggerian mood.
Mm.
You avoid disenchantment by orienting oneself in the world in such a way that you are attuned to this, right? But a mood is always a mood for Heidegger is a kind of orientation towards
Hmm.
a world that isn't giving the meaning in and of itself.
That's right.
And when you think of how mindfulness functions, like there's a reason you get Sam Harris interested in mindfulness and not his Jewish
Mm.
heritage, right? Like in the same way,
Mm.
or there's a reason the kind of champions of reductive
Mm.
scientism will be open to mindfulness and not other spiritual
Hmm.
things. And I
Hmm.
think part of it is when it can be structured towards a mood,
Hmm.
then ultimately you're the author of it, which is and it's a sign of the way you're seizing your finitude,
Hmm.
which is a
Exactly.
which doesn't have the graciousness at in the reservoir that Brother Lawrence had
Hmm.
in his description of
Hmm.
like, oh, I remember reading it while I had my first kid, going like, oh, I'm praying while I change a diaper. The orientation itself is birthed in you as a different
That's correct.
framework.
Well, again, Brother Lawrence had in mind a sort of I-thou relationship also.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it was a relational issue. And so, we're recalling Buber here. But I think that by you invoking Heidegger, it brings to mind also the idea of the acts, the idea that prayer is a practical activity that has to do with enacting something in the world and making it true. And that
Mm-hmm.
enactment, I think, is what makes it modern, is because it has to do with a technique, right? It's a technique. So, a distinctive characteristic of modernity is that we actually follow a process rationally derived by which we can efficiently move from one place to another. And that sense of technique is a mastering of oneself to be able to constrain it in a particular way in order to issue a particular result. And in that way, it moves. I think that it's still found in Brother Lewis. It's not the spirit of what he talks about necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's definitely moving in the same direction. And that also, by the way, makes it a profoundly social thing. It's a social
Mm-hmm.
thing in a different way, in the sense that I cannot accomplish this alone, because somehow learning what this process is and how to accomplish it is actually usually done in community, which is why the joke of yoga and contemplation in TVs and movies is always like you have a master, a yogi master, right? And then you have the disciples, and they're gathered around and they're told moment by moment what to do in order to affect a highly individualized effect. And I find profound connections between this and what is understood to be worship today. Worship is
Mm-hmm.
a corporate act. Worship is it's a way of getting a highly personalized or individualized connection to God, but it's supposed to happen in a corporate setting. And I've written about this to say that the person who's least likely to be worshiping is the person who's the worship leader, because the worship leader is trying to make sure that this process is handled in the correct way without disruption, and that it's done efficiently. You usually have only a particular period of time. But what it can result in this corporate setting is a more rapid opportunity for each participant to give themselves over and to finally feel that connection that they've been yearning for, that they can't seem to do on their own, in their car, in
Mm-hmm.
their home, when they're walking, those kind of things.
Well, if you're in charge and you lapse into worshiping, you might ruin their lunch
That's that's
appointments.
right. That's right.
Or just start crying, which I'll just say is not acceptable at a mainline Protestant church. Like if you all of a sudden realize that 1 Corinthians 15 really does seize you in ways that make what was 17 minutes when you practiced it 28 because you had to catch your breath and it really moved you, like they may not be interested in what the Holy Ghost extended.
No. Well, and you and I have both seen this in Pentecostal settings of various sorts. They are managed. You have a high level of discipline that's occurring. And there's a reason why you have ushers, even if there is a slaying in the spirit, even if you have dancing, it is in particular places at particular times, and you are choreographed, right? You are herded into particular spaces in order for that to
Yeah.
occur. And so that's what's always interesting to me, is how modern revivalism is, right? Revivalism is a particular method to invoke particular results, but it is done in a highly efficient manner, and it is done in particular time, in disciplined ways. And it has a start and an end. And my favorite book in my library, by the way, is one that's called How to Plan a Revival. I mean, I love that, because revival is not supposed to be. I mean, I thought that a revival is supposed to be spontaneous, but sure enough, published in the 1930s, it's really thick. And I'm like, yes,
There's a lot of details on planning a
this is the
revival.
heart of revival. Revival is not spontaneous. It is socially planned, constructed in order for me to have an experience and for us to have it together. So, crisis of meaning? Yeah, because that's the sustainability of that intensity is dependent on a situation that we cannot cultivate by ourselves. So that's why the withdrawal from that, the feeling, the leaky bucket of the spirit that we feel, I'm pulling on Durkheim in the way I understand him, We are energized in the ritual. We become most fully human in his framework. We become most fully human in the ritual, in that excitement, in the generating of that effervescence. But when we walk away from it, it leaks, it dissipates, it spills. And that's the mundane aspect of life, that people like Brother Lawrence was trying to re-invoke for us. How can we
Mm-hmm.
have that without that? And it's difficult because what the sociologist would say is that those kinds of things, if you define ultimate meaning as the ecstasy of religious experience, that's the only true moment at which you are really who you're supposed to be, then you're constantly going to be disappointed because the human body does not seem to be made for living in that moment, over and over again. That's called an addiction, right? That's something that you're trying to propel forward that leads you into unhealthy habits because our lives are to be lived in other ways. And I think that's also interesting. Like I read In the Name of the Rose recently, Echo's book about monastery, and it's interesting because what you learn is that the monastery is supposed to be a place where everyone's supposed to be highly spiritual, dedicated to particular ideas. But he accentuates all the differences that they have with each other, the theological disputes that they have, the different relationships of power, and ultimately it leads to a series of murders that occur in the monastery. So it's like it's a great way of kind of thinking through what does it mean for us to have a shared sense of meaning, even in an enclosed space. And guess what? It just doesn't seem to be the way our human nature works. So the more we try to enforce that, whether we
Mm-hmm.
enforce it in our families, in our churches, or in our country, it will always lead to a failure of accomplishing what we think is this sort of utopian way of thinking, right? That this is ultimately what we all should be sharing, because our children are always going to rebel. There are always going to be people out there who don't agree. We're always going to have there's always going to be something. And that's, I think, part of the challenge of just being human. But
Yeah.
humanity in modernity, humanity with difference and complexity, yeah, it's even accelerated.
Yeah, I guess one of the features now is that if they rebel, there's just a lot more options
Right.
as to how to show it
That's correct.
than Baptists. We just start a new church and believe the same things. Underneath there is that element of control that runs across a whole host of the different features. Right at the beginning, you talked about how, as a sociologist, modernity, you might focus on economy, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Control,
Hmm.
government, or family, or
Hmm.
work, or transportation, or communication, religion, and or science, and the way we understand things. And there's this sense that the modern subject has harnessed itself in the world in a way to control and manage reality, and that become like all of a sudden your own orientation in these different spheres becomes the way we manage anxiety about life. And yet, right, like you may have a book called Planning a Revival, but you can't plan a real revival. You may like right, and this is something Rosa talks about, right? Like that notion of uncontrollability. Like, how do you see that drive in modernity to control things, right?
Hmm.
All the way down to like insurance. Like, there's so many
Oh
things that
yeah.
that used to just be the accidental interruptions or acts of God in
Uh-huh.
scare quotes. Now that we have social and collective responses to manage it, like, how do you see that notion of control in modernity in all these different spheres problematizing the possibility for encounters, transcendence, collective effervescence,
Hmm.
these kinds of things that tend to be the markers of places where people point towards experiences of deep meaning.
Hmm. Agreed. Well, recently I'm going to take a different tack again, if you don't mind, but we can accelerate
You
to
can
the
do whatever you want.
I've been reading Thomas Hobbes, and he wrote two particular works that struck me, not just Leviathan, which is the longer one, but On the Citizen, that describes essentially the same ideas, just in a little bit shorter format. And what Hobbes speaks to is the attempt to control our situation so that we can maximize our opportunity for gaining wealth, protecting our own assets, gaining wealth, and gaining our own glory. He calls it glory. Like we're in pursuit of our own glory. And I love that, because then he assigns the role of the sovereign, the monarch, as the one that allows people the space for them to control their own lives without interference of others, without being afraid that other people are going to take their things or
Mm-hmm.
going to kill them or embarrass them. Okay. The difficulty with Hobbes' effort to try to support the monarchy is that the monarchs were still trying to control their own lands and their own places. Okay. Now, the monarchs got themselves in trouble because they had to give some sense of stability of private property, and in order to protect aspects of the realm that they could not access on their own. And so if you look in the history of England, it's fascinating to see the way in which these people were given more and more rights as long as they would protect the sovereign's territory. Okay. So that means that political rights had to be given. The monarch had to limit themselves in order to try to create some sense of control. And these lords and knights, they took that because it allowed them some measure of control on their own. Well, once you then get to the American Revolution, what you have is the democratization of the ability for each person to control their own territory, their own land, their own property, and to try to do that without fear of somebody taking it or killing them, right? So what you
Mm-hmm.
have over time is the expansion of individuals who want to have discretion over their own lives, right? And at that point, it's not really about meaning. It's about freedom. It's not about having the ability to just think your own thoughts or to have things. It's the idea that I want to be able to do whatever I want, to eat, to sleep, to work, to enjoy as I wish. It goes back to the first thing that I started with in terms of a pursuit of leisure, the idea that I can live the life that I had. Now, originally, as you know, that was meant for white men, white Protestant men who already had property. And so the same person who adopted these ideals, Thomas Jefferson, who popularized them, he himself owned slaves, right? And he even had a woman who is an enslaved person, who Jefferson, who popularized them. He himself owned slaves. The mention of this idea had to do with the expansion of people gaining personhood in the way in which they would have their own ability to live the way they want. Enslaved persons, then you continue and expand with gay, LGBTQ community and things like that, right? All of these things were seen as threats to a whole host of epistemic communities that assumed that privileges to define reality and define the orderly structures of society only belonged to a few people. So even
Yeah.
though they themselves had built themselves on the principle of freedom, freedom of personhood, property, and whatever they wanted to do, their own discretion, they limited the expansion of who that applied to. And that is part of what I think we're still living in now, is that
Mm-hmm.
the movement to create greater freedom and the ability then of religious conviction to be a part of that freedom is something that is deeply threatening to a lot of interests. And that you can call it a crisis of meaning, but it really has to do with, in many spheres, people trying to create the conditions for their own agency and self-discretion. And of course, anytime we try to exert our own agency and self-discretion away from structures of power, we are going to enter into places where the epistemic culture may not be as strongly defined, or it may not
Mm-hmm.
be as broadly shared. We may not have the communities that support in every aspect the ways in which we want to see the world, especially when we have other more powerful definitions out there, sometimes even legally defined, that would say, no, you don't matter. It doesn't touch you, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes a crisis
So
of meaning for both sides.
yeah, it underneath that, like I feel like there's that question of authority that in many
Absolutely.
ways generated modernity,
That's right.
right? So the authority, oh, is it this text or is it this tradition that gets deconstructed? Oh, is it reason Or is it science? And then, well, with the help of Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Darwin, we discover false consciousness. And so now even the self can't be an authority, and yet that's like the place we imagine having it. And like if you can't even know yourself and know you know yourself for whatever reason, like where do we go? And and when there's this kind of like claimed, if we are rejecting external authorities and continuously problematizing one the individual has access to, that seems like it also generates some new form of whatever freedom we might be clinging to.
That's right.
Underneath it. And it makes the quakings of nihilism bigger.
True, but I think that that's where, when you go back to the critical theorists of like Erich Fromm, Theodor Adorno, Marcuse, and much more recently, but still a part of that tradition in many ways, is Jürgen Habermas. This is exactly what they wanted to pull out. So Habermas makes clear, we live in a metaphysical way of thinking now. Okay, we cannot accept a singular way of understanding the world. We have to negotiate that there are going to be many different approaches, and this is sponsored in many different ways, which is why he emphasizes the communicative process. He wants to see democracy by the way in which we would actively negotiate with each other on the principles that we are all standing on the same ground and have to figure out how to live in this world together. And
so the integrity there is in the process, not the reference.
Absolutely. And he's not blind to the fact that we still have power structures, and we have ways in which voices are silenced, and we have ways, but he sort of puts us in a place of saying it's going to have to be an active negotiation. And that active negotiation is going to not have an ending point. It's going to have to continue. And it started with certain kinds of issues and questions that emerged in religious spheres, and it goes back to other issues as well. So he doesn't deny that religion is important. It's just that every time you try to close the gates on whatever you accept as reality, that's always going to be disrupted. And so we have to enter into active communicative negotiations with each other, and that's the only real hope that we have. But it's slow. That means admitting people who do not have power into the conversation, and people don't like that. It also means that maybe you have to hold the sense of what you think is true more loosely, and most everyone in the world is very uncomfortable with that.
Well, part of that I think is that like listening is hard. Like on the best days, like it's hard with my favorite human being who I've now been married to longer than I haven't. Like we have hard time listening to each other to decide how we plan the year and our budget. And there's no one else with more shared experience or shared the values that we have. There are three of them, and they have names, and we made them. Like, and even there, like listening is difficult at points. And so then to imagine that like we're going to have an easy solution for a world where you'd have almost none of that in common. Right? You can't even assume you all speak the same language in a democracy. It's just going to create something that is so difficult. And I wonder if that's part of what's going on in the meaning crisis, right? I mean, we can think of individuals in relationships where there are problems just because, if you think of the multiple communities someone may belong to, like the moment two partners belong to enough of different ones, then there just becomes tensions in meaning and values and such there.
Right.
But when we think of democracy, right, like it's not like democracy's just taking a position, but it's the art of taking one and then forming one while listening and then reforming solutions across difference. It's a deliberative process, right, that you were raising, not something that's just you perform it and then you do what you want.
That's correct.
And so if the time we're in is one where the decision-making process has to increase in its complexity because the world's moving faster, it's more dynamic, and we have more things to take into account. There are more people that get a voice now.
Mhm.
There are more perspectives, and they have less shared in common because our cultural diversity is one where there's less to even point at and be like, that's American or that's traditional. So a culture without a monologic or a dominant expression means that the demands on democracy are ginormous, and the decisions we have to make now have a longer and more irreversible horizon on it and would require more deliberation. And so genetic engineering, nuclear, the environmental crisis, any of those. So it just seems to me that like one element of the meaning crisis, like thinking back at how at the beginning you go, perhaps we problematize this by saying like there's a select group of our culture that's experiencing one and others didn't, is to go, a growing number of people go, I have no agency in a world that's determining me, and I don't even know what the hell I'm supposed to do about it. It's
Exactly.
just now
Mhm.
that like what used to be the upper middle class with humanities degrees is having the existential experience that a lot of other people had that goes, my agency says has very little impact on the world. We're facing problems I can do nothing about. And in order to do this together, I actually have to figure out how to relate to all these other people, and I don't think I could hear them, want to hear them, and they definitely don't want to hear me, and I'll never be heard. So, in lieu of the deliberative process, let's just seize the reins and tweet. Like, what role of that is it? That there's just a larger number of people realizing that they've been colonized and their agency doesn't matter.
Well, certainly that's exactly where my thinking is going, because the fact that we have more of a attempt to rule the world through executive orders,
Mm-hmm.
direct statements that then need to be adjudicated by the judicial branch, is by bypassing the entire process of politics. It's bypassing the entire process of deliberation. It's an attempt to exercise politics without politics, because it is simply going to say, guess what? We're going to just say, this is it. Make it happen. It's like Picard saying, make it so. And that's it. The assumption that a singular person can harness the sentiments of an entire group and, using the
Mm-hmm.
apparatus of power, simply just make it happen despite disagreement, because there's a belief that the disagreements are irreconcilable, will never get to a point where everybody can be happy. And if, rather than be unhappy, then I'd rather just go ahead and have my way, at least as close as it can to what makes sense to me in my own little world of the epistemic community. And not only is it reinforcing what I think about the world, it's now exerting the power to reshape the material conditions in a way that would be more consistent with the world as I think it should be.
Executive orders and algorithmic mediation of
Yes, yes, yes,
relations.
yes, yes, yes.
Uh, Do you think that kind of like algorithmic mediation? How, as a sociologist, do you see that uh, kind of? It's putting out fires with gasoline, right? Of that tribal consciousness.
Mm. Well, the algorithms is something that we're all still putting our heads around, because the algorithms are dictating more and more parts of our lives, and we're not even in a deliberative process at all. It's just a statistical coding model that is assuming that this is the best way. This is the best
Yeah,
answer.
we just accept the terms of the document we didn't open.
Exactly, exactly. We just sort of say, okay, and so it tells us what is the way, what is the right answer, what is the right solution, the right composition, the right things, because we're so busy trying to take care of so many other things, that we would love to have that kind of personal assistant who is taking care of what we think are the mundane tasks. Except we are now delegating the mundane tasks of, what's news? What is the thing that we should be paying attention to now? What's the framing for what's happening at the moment, right? Which voices are more important than others? What is offered as entertainment and what's valid as entertainment? And we're returning back to the beginnings of Hollywood, which I've spent time thinking and writing about, because before 1933, 35, those early moments of Hollywood, they were wild. What was depicted on screen, the kinds of things that were acceptable, we would, if we had allowed that to continue, we would just not be surprised at what we would see on television or movies, because it was already there at the birth. But what happened was the intervention by the Catholic Church to say, we need to have standards for what the narratives are and what language and depictions we use for this, right? And so the stamp of approval was required through the code to be able to even show a movie. It had to go through a filter. That filter
Mm-hmm.
is what gives us a sense that somehow earlier periods of American history were a lot more wholesome or moral than we have today. That is not true, but they insisted that every ending had to be a good winning over evil. Husbands and wives had to have particular relationships. Other things were not allowed, right? So the exercise of the movie code determined an entire culture that finally gets us to what we think of as the nostalgic 1950s. It wasn't until the 1960s and beyond where the breaking of those codes, the rated R films, the independent movie makers away from the movie system, and the diversification eventually of media channels. Paid HBO was probably the most prominent, but others that now say, hey, you know what? We don't have to be constrained by a particular moral code before we can have a type of entertainment. Okay. So what we have is a return in which executive authorities and other dominant expressions are attempting to redefine a moral code that won't just rule what we watch in terms of a movie. It's going to try to rule the curriculum that we have in elementary schools all the way through the college experience, that's exposed to the training in our military and all federal workers and beyond, right? It's trying to redefine a moral standard for what is acceptable within a particular epistemic culture. And that is already creating a crisis, because what they're attempting to impose already violates all kinds of things that we've thought we had already accepted as a society. So, so the issue of algorithms is, if to the extent that somebody can control what you're exposed to, that they are controlling, therefore, the kinds of morality, the kinds of narrative, and the kinds of priorities that you take on as saliency. And that's going to feed directly into the mental structures that you carry. And it's either going to clash with the material conditions, or it's going to seek to reshape them in particular ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's helpful. All right, Gerardo. I have four topics that I haven't asked you about. How about they're like a lightning round?
Okay,
So I don't
great.
want you to fall asleep.
I am
So
not
I'll just.
asleep, by the way. Don't pin that on me for your listeners, right? I am
Oh,
wide
no, no,
awake.
no. Well, look, for the listeners should know, Gerardo and I started late, and it was already going to start late. I had a snow day, kids not wanting to go to bed, and then our puppy just peed on me while doing bedtime reading. So, um, but there are a few features that show up that we haven't talked about. So I'm going to try to state them as boringly as possible, and then you just do what goes to a sociologist's head.
Okay.
Okay. So one is the thirst for transcendence in a world that pushes us towards the imminent frame. Like when you think of people across different disciplines and public intellectuals thinking about the meaning crisis, and they have this obsession with whatever it is where meaning might be, it needs to be in the imminent frame. What goes through your head?
Well, I think that we have to accept that not everybody is seeking transcendence. And I think that we are much more comfortable with a lot of different kinds of meaning that we can occupy ourselves with, as long as it gives us some sense of contentment or peace. And I think that there's an argument to be made that people may not be pursuing transcendence because it's creating more crisis than they actually want to deal with in everyday life.
Oh,
In
jeez.
everyday
This
life.
wasn't a. Speedy move. That would occasion a whole series of other questions. But
Another time.
yeah. So there's been a whole host of features that while these traditional structures, stories, narratives, communities are going down, there's a whole host of different new religious movements, spiritual but not religious, the nuns, all these kinds of things. And one of the weird things that shown up is both the stabilization of the nuns and the weird feature that while being stable, they still have as high as plenty of religious people beliefs about there being an ultimate reality or intense religious experiences and this kind of thing that's going on. So, like when you're looking at the self-report data,
Mm.
like what's going through your mind at the jumbling of all these categories about self-identity or institutional decline, while experiential reference are stable if not increasing.
That's a harder question to answer because you have too many other things going on. To summarize it briefly, you have structural conditions in terms of the way in which churches and other structures are attempting to sustain and survive. And the survival mode can exist regardless of whether it matches whatever's happening in the world. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Weber's classic statement on bureaucracy is there's a routinization of structures to deal with the contingencies of the world at the time. So bureaucracies routinize things in order to allow things to happen in a more efficient manner, but it actually closes itself off and pretends that there is no other change in the world. The reason why bureaucracies break down is because eventually the changes are so great that the bureaucracy becomes obsolete and can no longer keep up with it. Now, today, I actually heard a nice little dialogue with Christian Smith, who has a new book on religion as obsolescence. And he made a really interesting point. He said, typewriters were made for a time and were advanced, and everybody used them, and it fulfilled a particular function. People don't use typewriters anymore. They're considered obsolescent, but they still exist. And people can derive pleasure out of using a typewriter, and it will still get the job done. And so, as we have more pieces of our religious culture, if you can carry this metaphor forward, as we have more and more pieces of our religious culture that are left over and become obsolete, they still exist. They're still around. And so, there are people who can pick up different elements of things that had worked at different periods of time and may find religious fulfillment out of that. And communities can be built around those things. And what's interesting then is to see the hybridity of things that can come around, as well as new spaces that are created out of new forms of life, like attending church on the internet using an avatar kind of a thing, you know? So will there always be things that are left over that we can derive meaning from and finally feel like we have something that allows an enactment of a sense of ourselves and a sense of the sacred that we find meaningful? Yes. Will communities orient around that? Yes. Will it be complete? Never. And can we always find new combinations or innovations of how that's done, in addition to new things that continue to come around? Yes. So I think the likelihood is, will we ever see a large, monolithic religious structure ever again? That's hard to know, right? Our sci-fi models seem to think that we're all going to absorb into one giant church or temple someday. Everything that we see today does not lean in the direction of homogenizing or merging or melding together. It's instead a continued diversification based on the available elements that are allowed. And it allows us a play between the material conditions that exist and the mental structures that are trying to find some cohesion, some cogency and cohesion for how we make sense of ourselves in the world.
Mm-hmm. I was a part of a research project and was one of the few science and religion people there that was actually religious. And one of the things that drove them nuts was drove them nuts. It was one of these research questions like, I don't know what to do about this, but this is true, so we should figure this out. Is that looking at all the social, psychological benefits of of intrinsic religious practice, right? Like, which would be an active participant of any religious tradition, and like seeing all of that and the ways experiments in it where there isn't a transcendent referent don't generate the same benefits, right? And I had a friend of mine who is Irish and comes from, all the religious violence there, so he's militantly atheist, and he
Mm,
goes, it's a bloody blippity bleak fact that like it would be better if my daughter went to church every Sunday than quit smoking.
mm, mm,
You know,
mm,
and
mm.
and so there's that feature, and these are individuals who are looking at experiments of community without it. Like, so as a sociologist who's aware of that, but also looked at different religious ones and all their problems and baggage, like, what's going on with that? Like, if you're talking to religious studies professors and they're sitting there and they're thinking like, well, is there a way to get the benefits of this without this thing that
Yeah.
they're too wise for? Like, how do you see that conversation?
Yeah. So that's a tough one because, again, people are still parsing this out in terms of how belonging to a religious community seems better for your overall well-being. And to distinguish that from like a soccer club or, you know, a steady weekend with people or something like that, it's hard to parse out. One of the differences is that congregations still carry a very broad sense that we are profoundly a part of the same spiritual family. And that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
seem to be matched by going to like a comic book convention where you may feel real connection and affinity with people, but it's not the same level of depth. There's also a sense of moral obligation to each other that's carried in congregations that seems unique in comparison with other social spheres. And there is also an intention that I'm trying to look out for what's better for you. Even if it's only my own community, I'm going to watch out for
Mm-hmm.
you and I'm willing to help you. And so a lot of the service that happens in congregations comes through small groups. In other words, committed friends and family, more so than
Mm-hmm.
just because you're a part of a church. It still comes down to who are you connected to and who are the people who are going to be helping you affirm who you are, right? Giving you that sense of who you are and being willing to offer practical help when you need it. And to me, that really came alive when I was doing research on worship, because when I started talking to people who were part of their choirs, it was amazing how people talked about being a part of the choir of their church. I mean,
Yeah.
they would cry and tell these very deep stories, and they spent a lot more time together than even they themselves recognized because of the lunches and dinners, of the celebrations of birthdays and visiting people when they're sick. All of that was a part of being part of the choir, you know? And so
Mm-hmm.
the choir ended up being a very dynamic place where you are affirmed and a part of a community and able to do something that you feel like good about for other people,
Yeah.
that kind of carries it all together. And I think that things like choirs are hard to replicate in other aspects of our world.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting as someone who was the most religious person in the room and was like, I don't think this is as big a deal as you make it. And they're like, no, 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 we're serious. And one of the points, so this scholar gave a story about his adult kid, and basically said like, we either need to get a therapist or join the choir, was his statement, right? and
Mm,
and he was saying a lot, and
mm,
he started listing off the research. He's like, yeah, it's best if you go every week. It's also best if you go every week because of both, it needs to be oriented towards the transcendent. You need to have multiple people and generations that know your name and your face, and you need to have relationships that require enactment in times of need, where you have social trust. And
There you go.
God only does that. And then he said, and also human beings sang together before they could ever talk. And there's a reason religion emerges in song, trance, and dance before we ever had a text.
Mm.
And so the choir, Whitehead has this line where he moves to America to teach philosophy at Harvard after being, at Oxford for so long, and says, when he looks at American religion, he's like, there's just too many of them that talk first. And he goes, it's like they don't understand that they're the stewards of wonder.
Mm.
Religion is, and that's why the best religious traditions begin with an organ and singing before one person talks or tells someone else what to say. And now, what, only one of us likes to reread the dialogues of Whitehead each year, but it's one of those moments where you're like, oh, that's an observation about American religion is that you don't begin worship with the choir and an organ. You have someone come up and talk and tell you what you're about to do. And just thinking to that research group and sitting there where an ardent atheist is like, I told my kid he should join the choir, and he's in his 20s and depressed after college got done, and he's like, this is just statistically true, and he's like, and the sad thing is it worked. And then he told me that God loved me, and I was like, I didn't want to give him a hard time because he'd put himself together, which is the last question. Masculinity is also a contested subject the same time meaning is.
Yes.
I don't need to go through my thread that I might think that they're intertwined for you, but a lot of the responses to the meaning crisis that are popular in culture tend to be ones that are a certain performative version of retrieval, be it like Jordan Peterson,
Yep.
or I mean, I don't want
Yep.
to go through a list,
Yep.
but like, how are the changes that problematize macro structures of meaning related to, say, like gender roles and those
Yeah.
transformations?
Well, I think that the closest parallel that we may have there is we've accepted largely the notion of disenchantment when it comes to a transcendent sense of connection to the sacred and the spiritual. What may be an equally difficult, but the one that we're living through now, is a sort of disenchantment about the assumptions about what it means to be a man and the acceptance of what it means to respond and respect, or how do we say, sort of follow along with the way in which masculinity is supposed to work, the way
Mm-hmm.
I'm supposed to address a person, the way I'm supposed to automatically assume things about them, the way in which they expect to be treated, maybe the closest parallel is when the radical democratization removed titles like lords and sir and things like that, hundreds of years ago. We have people who expect to be treated in particular ways and never benefited from it, even though everything they had read or heard or seen idealized that this is what they should be treated, by their wives, by their coworkers or the people who work under them, by strangers on the street or the customer service representative. You know what I mean? It's like, and it's an affront to many people. So if I call and somebody says, "Who am I talking to?" and I say Gerardo Marti, they say, "Hey, Gerardo," like, I don't want to be treated, "Hey, Gerardo," I'm Dr. Marty or Professor Marty, like, and there's this part of me that says, how come I'm not treated the respect? But then I go, wait a second, what's going on that I would want to have that assumption operative in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's happening at a profound level, so that now, because these people have historically had access over resources, access over information flows, access over the entire destinies of entire peoples, if not nations, the pulling back of that is creating the condition for reasserting it. And with a belief that somehow if we don't reassert them, that we have lost something fundamental about ourselves and that we have lost something about our culture. They would be right. There is something that's different about the culture, but it's not because it's bad. You know, it's because of that steady progress of freedom, agency, a more radical egalitarianism that's supposed to extend to every person,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of their assignment of gender or assertion or their age or other things like that. And I think people find that hard, right? It's about hierarchy. And people want to invoke a hierarchy and respect it on the basis of hierarchy that they assume. But that hierarchy has not worked for everyone. And an unwillingness to accept that or to even notice it lies at the root of the unrest that creates these other conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that there's like a kind of new shift where, at one early in modernity, if we asked about unity, it was looking for uniformity. And then as kind of like questions of identity show up, we want unity in the form of community. So like, oh, well, how do we include X, Y, and Z
Right.
into this singularity?
Hmm.
And at this point, there's a recognition that the constant inclusion in the singularity is like still contains the same kind of power dynamic.
Yes.
And so we want a diversity with a deep solidarity. And it's that, like, if the normativity of patriarchy had difficulty extending to a more inclusive community,
Right.
the kind of problematizing of the one
Right.
of a deep solidarity shows up. It's similar to how we understand the shifts in the understanding of love. Like as a white Southern guy,
Mm.
what love looked like towards those that are in the power structure above you is compliance. Like that's what it looks like. Like this is love looks like obedience and compliance. And then right like oh, well you get there starts to be this kind of cultural growth of oh, well we don't need to be authoritarian. So then there's this kind of acceptance, right? So that the power is like more open to you. So like, what is it like to accept your kid? Well, we're going to give them more voice, or we're going to do this, and there's this notion of acceptance. But all the time, like moving from this expectation of compliance and obedience as an expression of love. Oh, we're going to accept you, so now you're okay. Like, let me as the top give you affirmation. That's different than like let us regenerate the orient like our relationships
Mhm.
in ones where this inherited structure of power is not there.
Right.
And it seems to me that there are these kind of shifts. And if you ask whose story is one where compliance and uniformity are now off the table, at the same
Mhm.
time, the narratives that came with like breadwinner, the ability for blue collar work, dignity. There are all these material features that are being undermined that used to legitimate that narrative to many men in our culture, and then the social structures having going through these shifts. It's easy to see men going a growing number of men going, I have no place, and so my response is, let me go backwards. Oh, let's not try to regenerate our social structure. Let's go, well, okay, I'll accept you, but not those people, not the trans ones, and not in sports or not in this. And if you're going to piss me off, we're just going to demand compliance and do it
Right.
with an executive order.
Right.
Oh, we're not going to, oh, we, deep solidarity, that's uncomfortable because I didn't volunteer to reorganize my entire existence. I was cool with community
Mhm.
and I was having things, but like I didn't need it to cost me something significant, be it social, economic, or cultural privilege. And if you're not going to let me at least deal with community, I thought was a nice liberal compromise, I'm going to go back to uniformity and you can get over it.
Yeah.
Right? Like it seems to me
Absolutely.
like the masculinity crisis in the meaning crisis have these kind of like cross pressures of where the horizon of being at home in the world looks like.
Absolutely. Just to visit historically, remember that one of the most radical moves that happened in American society was when all men could vote. The expansion of the vote to all men, the enfranchisement of men into the vote. Now, of course, that was a welcome change to all these men who had no property, who had
Mm-hmm.
no title and said, okay, we can do it, and new immigrants. And remember homesteading acts that mostly benefited exactly these people, giving away literally free land. That was accepted. But it took considerably longer to understand about the enfranchisement of Black men, because that's where it had to start. And those were not accepted. They were seen as direct threats. These same men who had gotten more political power and their voice mattered more are the same men in California who led the government to kick out all of the Chinese because they were taking away their opportunities, and eventually kicked out the Japanese and every other Asian because they were also taking away those opportunities that they felt belonged only to them. When the women fought for their own vote, they weren't all on board, right? Because that was an expansion of the same principle, but it wasn't, it was diluting their influence, right? It was perceived to
Mm-hmm.
be diluting their influence instead of expanding the same principle. And then as we move forward into other rights and the kinds of recognitions that you're talking about today, it's always seen as diluting and taking away and robbing the kind of earned or deserved influence and stature that these propertyless, masterless, but would hopefully yearn to and successfully in some ways entrepreneurially build their wealth and be able to get that power, right? Because they did it of their own, self
Yeah.
will, right? But those opportunities were being taken away from other people. And so it becomes then an expectation that's built in that is constantly in their minds thwarted. And so we definitely see why that would be an issue today.
Oh, that's awesome. Gerardo, I've had a lot of fun talking to you. And we got through 4 of the 8 bullet points with lots of letters underneath it on my topics. I don't know how we did with all the things you wrote down based on my weird paragraph for this conversation that I sent you. Which, by the way, you can assess this. Gerardo was like, so what's 2 to 3 sentences on what the meaning crisis is? And Tripp's answer was the contemporary spiritual crisis arises from the loss of traditional religious frameworks, the limitations of exclusive humanism, the unique challenges of modernity, including the disenchantment of the world, the problem of suffering, the rise of pseudo-religious ideologies, the crisis of self-actualization, the tension between immanence and transcendence, and the meta-crisis of our time. These features of modernity created a situation where many feel a profound sense of disorientation, meaningless, and a need for a new way of being in the world. I feel like we talked about a lot of that. We didn't get to the last point where you explain how we should, just all come to Jesus and fix everything. But we'll just have to do that next time.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, Chris. I enjoy it, and let's try to solve the world's problems just a day at a time, right?
Yes.